On October 14th, 1912, Theodore Roosevelt was on the campaign trail in Milwaukee running for another term. It was a tough race. Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson proved to be a formidable opponent, and William Howard Taft, while unpopular, was the Republican incumbent. Roosevelt was running as a third-party progressive, and in order to keep pace with his big-ticket rivals, he had to work hard. By this point in the election season, he was giving 15 to 20 speeches per day, most of which stretched on for an hour or sometimes even more. But this day, TR didn't feel too well. His throat was scratchy, he was tired, and so he planned a relatively quick stop.
Well, what Roosevelt didn't know, and certainly his security detail didn't know, was that a man with a .38 caliber revolver had been following them since the campaign left New Orleans. He had ridden quietly for over 1,000 miles, just waiting for his chance to get a shot at Roosevelt.
John Schrenk was a Bavarian-born saloon keeper from New York. He'd had some strange and troubling dreams in recent months, mostly about President McKinley, whose assassination resulted in Roosevelt's first term. In his dreams, Schrenk said that President McKinley asked him to revenge his death and protect democracy from a three-term president. All Schrenk had to do was to kill Roosevelt before he could be reelected.
Roosevelt was standing in his automobile, waving at the crowds. Well, at the front of those crowds was Schrenk, who saw his opportunity to get a shot off at Roosevelt. Well, right when Schrenk drew his pistol from beneath his coat, three things happened in a very short amount of time. The first was a bystander saw Schrenk's pistol and tried to knock it out of his hand, throwing off his aim. The second thing that happened was the bodyguards that had been assigned to protect Roosevelt saw the gun and jumped out of the car, rushing Schrenk. The third thing that happened was Schrenk pulled the trigger. He had originally meant to hit Roosevelt in the head, but that knock from the bystander and the threat of the security guard rushing his way threw off his aim, and he hit Roosevelt square in the chest.
But it turns out that Teddy's long-winded speeches saved his life that day. The bullet traveled through a 50-page copy of his prepared speech and a steel eyeglasses case that he carried in the same pocket. The bullet was slowed enough not to reach his lungs or heart, which Teddy deduced from the absence of blood when he spoke or coughed. He refused to go to the hospital and insisted on giving his speech.
Immediately after being shot, Roosevelt was quoted to have said, "Friends, I ask you to be as quiet as possible. I do not know if you fully understand that I have been shot, but I want you to know that it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Afterwards, he continued to speak for another 55 minutes, although some estimates say it was around 90 minutes, still wearing that blood-soaked shirt. Immediately after he finished speaking, those around him rushed him to the hospital.
Roosevelt would spend the next 8 days in the hospital. The bullet had lodged in his chest wall, and removing it was deemed too unsafe. The wound healed, and he never reported trouble from the injury again. Despite having lived through his assassination attempt, the presidency would not be Teddy's again. Woodrow Wilson's 41% of the vote meant the office would now be his, though Roosevelt did beat out incumbent Taft, marking the only time a sitting president has come in third place in a re-election bid. Schrenk, in the meantime, was apprehended immediately. He lived the rest of his life in an insane asylum and died of pneumonia in 1943.
I tell you what, I saw the whole thing. Mr. Roosevelt up there talking and waving his arms, and all of a sudden this little fella here in the front row whips out his pistol and shoots Mr. Roosevelt right in the chest. Well, about this time, this big, mean-looking fella hops out of the Mr. Roosevelt's car, and he charges that little fella with the gun. And well, it just kind of ended up like one of them there bowling alleys where and that was the end of the guy with the pistol. Now, see, Mr. Roosevelt, he kept right on talking even though he'd been shot. Well, it turns out his speech was so thick in his pocket that it plumb stopped the bullet.